All right, everyone, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into a story that'll leave you wondering what justice really means.
Yeah, this one's got it all.
We're talking about Jane Veloso, a Filipino woman who was practically staring down the barrel of a firing squad in Indonesia.
Accused of drug trafficking, spent years on death row, the whole 9 yards.
But then, just hours before her scheduled execution, bam, a reprieve.
And get this, some newspapers even printed her obituary before the news of the reprieve came through.
Crazy, right?
Absolutely wild.
So today we're going to unpack her story, trace her journey from a hopeful migrant worker to a pawn in the international drug trade, and then back again.
We'll look at how her case became a flashpoint, raising all sorts of questions about human trafficking, the death penalty, and what it really means to get a second chance.
So let's rewind back to 2010. Picture this. Yogyakarta Airport in Indonesia.
Okay.
Veloso, a young mother of two, gets caught with a suitcase packed with 2.6 kilograms of heroin.
Wow.
That's a serious amount.
Enough to land anyone in some deep trouble.
And she did.
Rightfully so, some might say.
But here's the twist. From the get-go, Veloso maintained she was innocent, claiming she was tricked, that the drugs were sewn into the bag by someone she trusted.
Someone who had promised her a job as a maid in Indonesia.
A classic case of an unwitting drug mule, perhaps.
It's a story we've heard before, unfortunately, especially among migrant workers desperate for a better life.
Yeah, I mean, you can almost understand how someone in a vulnerable position might overlook red flags when they're offered what seems like a golden opportunity.
Absolutely. The desperation, the pressure to provide for their families back home, it can make people susceptible to these kinds of schemes.
So Veloso ends up in prison, separated from her children, facing a potential death sentence.
Talk about a nightmare scenario.
And she stayed there for years, fighting for her life, clinging to the hope that someone would believe her.
And this is where things get really interesting. In 2015, the year of her scheduled execution, then Philippine President Benigno Aquino III steps in.
A last-minute appeal for clemency.
And it worked.
Just hours before she was set to face the firing squad, Veloso is granted a reprieve.
A stay of execution.
What a roller coaster of emotions that must have been.
Oh, absolutely. I can't even imagine.
But what's even crazier is that, as we mentioned earlier, some newspapers back in the Philippines had already jumped the gun and reported her execution.
Talk about a media blunder.
Yeah, a stark reminder of how quickly information and misinformation can spread.
And the power of those headlines, even if they're wrong.
Absolutely. So the reprieve buys Veloso some time, but it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Right. The legal battle continues.
And it's a long one. It wasn't until recently, after a deal was struck between the Philippine and Indonesian governments, that she was finally able to return home.
But even then, she came back as a prisoner, still under the shadow of that drug trafficking conviction.
So it's a bittersweet victory, right? She's back on home soil, but not completely free.
Yeah, it raises some thorny questions about what true justice looks like.
Is it simply escaping death?
Or does it require full exoneration?
Acknowledgement of innocence.
These are tough questions.
Especially when you consider that the death penalty has been abolished in the Philippines.
So, for many Filipinos, Veloso's story is a powerful symbol.
They see her as a victim of circumstance.
Someone who was exploited, who deserves a real second chance.
And her story resonates deeply with the millions of Filipinos who, like Veloso, have sought work abroad, often facing precarious conditions and vulnerabilities.
It's a reminder of the human cost of poverty and desperation.
And the systemic issues that make people susceptible to exploitation.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't know about you, but when I read about Veloso leaving that Indonesian prison with gifts from her fellow inmates, a t-shirt, some knitting supplies, it really got to me.
Yeah, me too. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of places, human connection and compassion can shine through.
That even within a system designed for punishment, there's still room for kindness.
Yeah.
And speaking of systems, I can't help but think about the recent return of the Bali 9 drug ring members to Australia after serving nearly 2 decades in Indonesian prisons.
Yeah, that was a big deal.
It makes me wonder if we're seeing a shift in Indonesia's approach to drug offenses, maybe even a softening on their stance on capital punishment.
It's definitely something to watch.
Because these cases have far-reaching implications, not just for the individuals involved, but for international law and human rights.
Exactly.
So where does all of this leave us? We've got Jane Veloso back in the Philippines, but still fighting for her freedom. We've got the echoes of other high-profile cases like the Bali 9, prompting us to reconsider our approaches to justice and punishment.
And ultimately, we're left with a whole lot of questions
What does Veloso's case tell us about the complexities of international law?
about the fight against human trafficking,
About the ethical considerations of the death penalty?
and about the very nature of justice itself.
We may not have all the answers, but one thing's for sure, this is a story that will stay with us.
A story that challenges us to think deeply about the choices we make, the systems we create, and the kind of world we want to live in.
And that's what we're all about here, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.